What kind of justifications then qualify as ethical considerations? Well, exclusively self-serving ones seem inappropriate. They're out of the domain of ethical. There seems to be at least some requirement that an added benefit beyond the self must be present. I want to murder the king, so I can become king. Doesn't count. Well, I want to kill the king and take his place because the current one is a tyrant and spreads misery. Well now, consider the case in Star Trek with the demise of the android Data. The antagonists, the people in the lab, want to make more Datas, and the main representative seems personally upset when he meets resistance to the proposed course of action, to what he sees as the only obvious course of action. More Datas better than one. Or is that his intent? And why do we find it unsettling that the antagonist is emotionally upset when his request is refused? It's like he's personally invested. It's not a disappointment for the greater good. It's a personal attack. That's what it seems to me, anyway. What about you? Do people get upset because they don't get their own way? Or is it because they're feeling sad about the consequential loss, the outcome? I know that I held my head in my hands when I was told that Epstein was found dead. It was not pity for the man at all. It's for all the victims, the alleged victims, being denied the truth of the matter, being denied their day in court and being denied their justice, closure, and to have the world know what had actually happened. It'll be interesting to see what kind of deal Bannon gets, but by the time this comes out, maybe we shall know more, and of Ghislaine Maxwell also. Yet, at the time of writing, my own government is pushing through the internal market bill that explicitly breaks a treaty, the withdrawal agreement, that is international law, that the very same party was instrumental in getting crafted in the first place. It's the same kind of thing. Now it doesn't suit, I want to break the agreement. You know, you can't have it both ways. Either make agreements or don't make agreements. If you're making agreements with the sole intention to break them later on, one has to ask, would you do business with people who break their contracts? Or weasel out of it by saying it's breaking the law in limited and specific ways? I wonder if I can use that as a defence in court when I charged or brought into trial for stealing specifically 3 Mercedes AMG limited edition cars. I know it's not in the same sense limited, but poking fun. Anyway, I mean, there's a tweet gone out tonight, Charlie Kirk, calling for people to face jail time for encouraging the lockdown of the current contagion and thereby killing jobs. And one has to say, well, if it's a criminal offence for which one can go to prison for killing jobs, then surely playing down, as Trump has admitted, the dangers of the COVID, which kills people, is severely more punishable. One rule for one rule for the others. And I have to say, this is unfortunately fairly typical of British politics. Kind of make it up as you go along. You know, it's not that there's one rule for one and one rule for another. It's that, that rule didn't suit us anymore, so we've changed it. And by the time you get to learn about it and try to exploit it yourself, we'll have changed it again. It's short-term, back of the envelope kind of stuff. It's kind of what British politics is known for. But don't be deceived by this. This is actually an incredibly powerful position. It's almost unchecked power. But that's a story for another day. So for me, this is the tip-off. When people have no argument or can't justify an argument or their morals, or caught in hypocrisy, as the Charlie Kirk tweet, they enter the choosing beggars cycle, which we've covered before. Shock at their entitlement or assumption of being right, on the assumption of holding the view that theirs is the only view that counts or that matters, or that they think it's irrefutable, having just been so simply refuted. Then denial that the other party actually has a valid counter-argument, and therefore that they, the first person, is actually fallible. Then anger, that their pathway to their treasure or gains has been blocked. Then bargaining, where they try other methods to get their way. Rather than argue the merits of their case or find new arguments, they try to bargain around them, usually by offering something that they think the counterparty values. So it's a way to corrupt the counterparty by getting them to enter into what amounts to a bad faith agreement. Usually this is the lowest common denominator, money. Or, in the case of choosing beggars, exposure on their social media platform of 10 people. And then there's a final phase of testing, where this is kind of like the test for the counterparty. Are they easily bought, or are they actually people of integrity? And then comes the choice point. Do they go back to denial, or do they actually go into acceptance and move on? It's also interesting watching online arguments. It's the same pattern that people take, when they say something stupid or reactionary and somebody with a really good argument cuts them down. They'll go into the same kind of denial, anger, denial, bargaining routine. Then they'll throw in ad hominem straw man, they'll attack a straw man, and then when they're still not winning, they'll try and project a perceived hypocrisy in the counterclaimant, and then when that doesn't, then they'll just resort to insults and withdraw by something like, well, fuck you and your mum anyway. It's really quite predictable. And I've even been in arguments where I've said to the person, the idiot, I said, according to this model, this is going to be your next step. You are now going to enter a phase of denial, or you're going to come back and start argue strawmans. And I said, even though I've stated it, even though you know now what I'm expecting, you can't help yourself. It's so ingrained, you'll do it anyway. And they do. And then I come back and say, well, that's that phase over with. Now you're probably going to try and project some kind of hypocrisy onto me. And even though that I've explained it and you know that I'm expecting it, it's so irresistible, you can't not do it. And they do. It's remarkable. So here's the trick then. Now that we know this, Rule 303, if you have the ability, you have the responsibility to act. So it means that, now that we know these patterns are in people, we have to head them off. It's our responsibility to do that. So we don't antagonize the anger stage. We don't argue or rebut their denial. We just accept it. And I've seen a few interviews go really well like this. Like someone will phone into a radio show and the host is really good at this. So the caller will say, you're a tiny-minded egomaniac who just likes to prove his point. And rather than engage with that, the radio host will just go, yes, I am, absolutely. Now, what was your point? What can you say? He's gone into agreement with you. Yes, I am. But what's your point? Oh, that I was an egomaniac is your point. Well, that doesn't answer anything to do with Brexit, politics, current affairs, whatever the discussion's about. But I just wanted to do a quick note and say that the kind of second to last phase where the person does the testing before choice point of going back to denial or acceptance, where they'll offer essentially a bribe to try and corrupt the process. So if someone's shown integrity, no, I can't sell my artwork for $10. Normally it's $1,000. It takes me 6 weeks to do it. I can't just let it go for $10. And then the person, denial, anger, straw man arguments. Well, it doesn't. It takes other people 2 weeks. Why are you so special? Blah blah blah. And then they'll say, look, maybe I can give you something else of interest. It's a test to see whether the other person's actually really does value their work at £1,000 or whatever. It's a test to corrupt. And when the person maintains integrity and says, no, the price is the price, it backfires when people refuse the bribe on ethical grounds. And then offering money to soothe one's conscience is just an added insult. This testing phase, it's almost as though the original person is still in disbelief. They can't believe that someone has integrity. They have to test it again and to offer a different incentive to see if the counterparty can be enticed, or whether this really is actually an ethical refusal or a refusal on principle rather than an issue of price. US politics is moving so fast at the moment, and it's given us another great example to learn from. In the last video, I raised the issue of the proposed second round stimulus bill in the United States to assist with COVID relief. Pelosi was negotiating for a $2.4 trillion relief fund that was rejected unceremoniously by Trump. So here's the thing. One could speculate and say that the $2.4 trillion is high, deliberately high. That it's been a ploy knowing that the Republicans or Trump would veto it. This makes the Republicans and Trump look bad, rejecting a stimulus package when so many are in desperate need. Yes, it does. But unfortunately, the only people who will care about Trump looking bad are Democratic voters anyway. Yeah, it's kind of simplistic. The Trump base seems to be so solid that they will agree with Trump rejecting this deal. I mean, we have heard them say, some of them anyway, that they are prepared to die for the economy. So I assume them being poor, poverty, kicked out of their home, can't afford food would be no problem. So Trump has countered with a $1.8 trillion price tag. However, included in there are provisions for corporate indemnity against liabilities arising from COVID infections in the workplace. That is to say, if a company makes no provisions to protect its workforce and the workforce gets COVID and dies, the company has no liability. And that tells us all we need to know about where priorities lie. So now Pelosi's in a bit of a bind. The Republicans have been stalling this negotiation for quite some time, and it now being so close to the election, an acceptance of Trump's counter-proposal will look like a win for Trump. 1.8 trillion is better than no deal at all, right? Well, this is where the consequentialism and virtue comes into effect in very real ways. Trump, it seems, is trying to push through a weaker stimulus bill right before the election to shore up his voter support. And at the time of recording, they look very dire. I think the tracking websites put Trump at 16% to win. And at the time of recording, it looks like Georgia is about to flip, giving the Democrats another possible 12 seats, I think. Yeah, so Trump needs this deal to look good, to look as though he's achieved something, to be able to show a win. Well, a win for who? Certainly the corporate owners are going to love him for this one. Immunity from COVID liabilities. Wow, cost savings in not being responsible for providing PPE or for not making workplace modifications to ensure safety of workers is an immense saving. I mean, let's be honest, if I'm not liable for, as a corporate owner, if I'm not liable for any member of my work staff catching an infectious disease, then why would I bother putting in any protection? I mean, the law sometimes works in mysterious ways. It might even be seen that if I did make an effort to put in some minimal protection, that in some way shows that I knew it was a risk, and therefore that might actually create liability. Yeah, it's a disaster, that one. Anyway, since the Republican Party has stonewalled this bill for 6 or 7 months, is it okay? This is the question. Is it okay for Pelosi and Democrats to accept Trump's counter-proposal so that 1.6 trillion is flooded into the relief fund? And, by the way, to give an inkling of what else is going on, the desperate situation over there, millions of people in dire circumstances, millions facing evictions. And there is a moratorium on eviction, but despite this, the White House, not necessarily the Republican Party, the White House is advising landlords to start eviction proceedings. It's a bit of a ploy, isn't it? It's telling the Democrats and Pelosi, look, people are going to be homeless. You better accept this 1.6 trillion or, well, it's out of our hands. Landlords are starting eviction proceedings. What can we do? It's dirty tactics. If Pelosi accepts the relief fund as it is and it goes through, it makes Trump look good. The outcome here is minimal support to Americans and support to corporate America, and makes Trump's chances better for winning the election. That's all bad. On the other hand, if Pelosi says no, and she wants something better, and to get that immunity clause out of there, then the Republicans can just sit on it again, stonewall it, and make it out that things only move when they want, power play. Or they can say, see, look, the Democrats, they just can't organise anything. They're making the American people suffer with their delays. Now, if this is a strategic advantage to Trump and he gets his way and it looks good and Trump gets back in and it's enough for him to make up the shortfall in his voting support, and if he gets back into power, what's going to happen to all those eviction moratoriums? Brushed aside. And now people evicted, workers, now even more desperate for work and money, combined with the corporate immunity from COVID liability, yeah, that's just a humanitarian disaster waiting to happen. Can you see the trick in the negotiation? Trump gives no shits about $600 billion, 2.4 trillion, 1.8, 1.6, whatever. It makes no difference. It's just money out of thin air, that. And it's not like he's liable for it. Again, it's just a burden passed on to future taxpayers. So it's not about 2.4, 1.8. For him, it's looking like he got a good deal and showing support for corporations with the immunity clauses. And for him, it's a lift in election prospects. So, yeah, he doesn't give a shit about the money. For Pelosi, the money is the important bit. That people are suffering and face dire consequences without this stimulus package. The question is it right for Pelosi to hold out, hoping for a better deal, to take time to be strong in negotiations and go back with a counter offer? Being that the election is 3 weeks away, That's 3 more weeks of angst for the population, plus the confusion, no doubt, over the election period, plus the shake-up in the Senate and the House of Representatives, this Amy Coney Barrett thing, and then Biden won't take office until January, which I don't know how that could work out, but that could be 2 or 3 more months that the Republican Party and Trump administration hold things up, but to what end? If they're out, they're out. And the winter months are here, and it gets cold over there. New York, it's -10 Celsius. That's no laughing matter. So in this negotiation then, each party is giving up a small benefit to gain a larger one. Trump's given up $600 billion for his look good and a win and his corporate support. I'm not sure what Pelosi can give up to move the negotiation forward. So this is why I say she's in a bit of a hard place. This kind of bartering of concessions is, normally par for the course. But with the political backdrop, the optics are very important. Giving up a small concession could have huge political fallout. Sometimes the consequences are greater than getting nothing at all. And here we are. If Pelosi concedes and gets $1.8 trillion with the horrible strings attached, great, short term. But if this win for Trump is spun to his political advantage and he gets 4 more years, that stimulus package will not matter in the slightest bit in the wake of the devastation that will follow. Not that 2.4 trillion or 1.8 trillion will make much of a dent anyway. So I'll get it on the record as though my voice counts or anything. I'm of the opinion that yes, Pelosi should hold out for a better deal and take it beyond 3 more weeks. And while that sounds callous, the consequences are worse if she capitulates. And we can see now how this is positioned as being all Pelosi's fault. It's down to her whether the American people get their money, their relief, or whether they suffer 3 more weeks. It's all the do-nothing Democrats. And for some strange reason, it takes people 3 attempts to be satisfied that, yes, this really is a matter of principle. No, I'm not open to bribery. No, I'm really not open to bribery. No, I'm really not open to bribery. I don't make the rules, that's the way it is. Anyway, yeah, we mentioned this before. This is a choice point. The choosing beggar will issue a final last chance of offer. And when rebuffed for the final time, choice point is presented to accept the refusal, go back to denial and anger and start the cycle again. The point also seems to turn on how much face saving is generated. So imagine someone calling into a radio show, telling the host, they're a fashy bully boy who controls the mic volume and just likes to show off how smart they are. Well, isn't it an amazing act of grace and face saving to grant the caller that? Yes, I am. So then tell me your point. They say face. I accept. Guilty as charged. Now, what was your point? There's quite a bit more to that strategy as well. It is complicated, as is anything to do with human dynamics. Some people are nervous or some people are aggressive and they might call in and their opening gambit might be to say something contentious like that is basically a mine that they can trip or it's a trap that they can set that they can call in on later in the conversation if it doesn't go to their liking. So if you make the claim someone's an obnoxious dickhead and then they say, yes, I am, what was your point? And then if you're not able to get over your point, you can say, see, you even agreed you were an obnoxious dickhead and you were always going to disagree with what I said anyway. To me, it's interesting that they've laid the groundwork for their own face saving later, almost as though they know they're going to need it somehow. It may also be a learned strategy that they've won in other conversations, again, to open up a conversation by using an insult or laying the potential to spring this trap. It invites an emotional agitation. And again, see I can't remember what it's called, the courtroom lizard theory, the lizard theory of the courtroom, the lizard brain, reptile courtroom theory, I don't know what it's called, but an attempt to appeal to emotion or to use rhetoric and emotional responses of the audience listening to win favour or gain sympathy and to win an argument over how much sympathy you can garner rather than actual points that you can negotiate. It's also a tactic whereby the main core of the argument is sidelined and diminished in comparison to laying all this emotion into what amounts to a personal attack. So then the discussion is ambushed, it's sidetracked, it's derailed, and it doesn't become a discussion or a negotiation or a debate about the core points. It now becomes a quarrel about personality or rhetoric style, or I don't like you and my judgment about you is confirmed. So what? Nothing to do with the core issues, so it's a bit of a distraction, a red herring. If it's Twitter or Facebook, they take to blocking people. If you're really, really rich asshole with a large following, you stir up some bullshit around being cancelled or having free speech curtailed. Or if you're really fucking rich, you fire in a slap lawsuit, frivolous as it may be. This is, of course, bullying. But they'll go, curtailing my free speech, let me bully you and, fire in some slap orders. Anyway, so what about ethics? The golden rule, do unto others, or the platinum rule, do unto others the way they want us to do unto them. I accept your insult. Now, what's your point? Kant developed his famous formula, or his maxim: act only on that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. So this is what I was saying a moment ago about the ridiculous tweet that's gone out tonight that charges people who have killed jobs by insisting on a lockdown should face prison time. The consistency would demand a higher penalty for those who have played down the danger of the virus and admitted to doing so, and in doing so caused more death, literally killed people rather than jobs. Surely they should face just as stringent punishment. This gives the notion, what Kant was talking about is having a notion of universality. One rule for all applies to everyone all the time at the same way under the same conditions. So in this way we can develop or think about a moral principle that applies to all and still be satisfactory in terms of being a process that all can accept. It's like the cutting of the cake, first cut, last to pick. It seems to have an inbuilt equity about it. And I do say equity because the results are not necessarily equal, but equitable. So after the cutting of the cake, the first to pick, I assume, will go for the largest piece. But maybe not. Not always. Some might pick according to their needs. They might not want the bigger piece. And some cutters of the cake are indifferent, don't really care, and will cut the thing any old way, sometimes in artful ways, where it's not always easy to see or measure the size of the pieces cut. Kant's formula has to also do with being logically possible for universality. I'll come back to that in a minute. And there's one more thing about Data in that Star Trek episode, and the question of what extent we ought to consider preference of sentient life and animals other than humans, if at all. While I've now drawn attention to how our sense of morality may be influenced by cultural artifacts of our circumstances, our socio-economic standing, cultural relevance, geographic and class context, including language, and how we might assume that certain principles are self-evident, and because we live, say, in a large group or a country with fairly similar views, we think that's just the way that it is. I recall a documentary about these three young kids that went to work in faraway lands. It was a small village in the middle of, nowhere, and it was one of these small projects that it was a fair trade thing or something like that, where they were trying to get these small villages back on their feet, start growing coffee beans. And two of the kids went out there, really pitched in, back-breaking work. 10 hours a day just weeding, bent over, weeding, and it was hard graft. And they did get paid for their work. It was almost a token amount of money. And one of the three actually worked out that he only needed to work 3 hours to earn enough money that would pay for his lodge and just pay for a minimal amount of food. And that's all he was interested in, because the work and the extra money, he had no utility there. It's not like he could go and watch a film or spend the money in some other way. The only things he could buy was a bed for the night and some food. That was it. But then when the local market cottoned on that he was only doing 3 hours and taking a minimum amount of money, they just wouldn't sell him food at any price. Because it was like, no, if you're not going to put in full effort, you're not going to, we're not going to sell you the food. You have to work hard as everyone else, because we'd rather sell to them when they come to the market later after they've worked hard. Here you are buying it all up. So he learned a harsh lesson that it's not just about the exchange of capital, it's more than that. And I'll come back to this as well. It's interesting game theory, the tragedy of the commons, and it's to do with like how in some regions they've organised themselves in equitable ways that don't necessarily give a fair result, but it is equitable. So, for example, they have water supply coming down a natural river that they've dammed, and then farmers at the top of that stream siphon off as much water as they need for their crops. and then any excess water is allowed to flow downstream so that crops further down get less water, crops further down get even less water. So what happens is that the crops that need a lot of water are grown at the top, and the crops that don't need a lot of water are grown down at the bottom. So the farmers down at the bottom don't earn a lot because they can't grow a lot and it's shitty crops. It's not the good stuff. But the way that it works is that the farmers down at the bottom who don't earn a lot of money from their crop are actually employed to maintain the dam and the waterways at the top. So they reap equity from the interest in those lush crops from the top through labour, not through crop. But the ones at the top get it, obviously, from the benefit of having first dibs on the water. Kind of works out because, I mean, what are those guys down at the bottom going to do? They're going to sell their crop for money, but if they get money from being paid to service the irrigation systems, then it's not equitable in the sense that they can't all grow the same amount of crop to the same quantity, but they approximately get paid the same at the end of the day. Just going back to Peter Singer's notion of preferences and humans and animals, what is, and groups and tribes and different ethical standards that some people assume just to be axiomatic, why is that? And so the question we ask is, what's the largest group you and I belong to? It's not tribal, it's not county, it's not country, it's global, it's earthling, it's species. So while at first blush it seems obvious, similarly from a default position, of course, naturally axiomatic, human life takes precedent over all other species. Sure, I agree. But what if I asked why? What's the substantive argument? And beware, we know they're choosing Beggars cycle, so you can't try that one on me. So okay, why? What's the argument? Now you can't say, well, just because. Because that's the just so argument, and that's not an argument. So would you get angry now, or more frustrated, if I insisted on a sound and valid argument as to why human species should take precedent over other species? What might be the standard response to that? You obviously don't care about humans. Straw man argument, a little bit of ad hominem, maybe, a little bit of pointed hypocrisy in there, I smell. Or how about, you must be stupid if you think animals count more, which is a deflection with added ad hominem attack. Provides no argument. So again, it's a pattern of rhetoric, no argument, go on the attack, double down, prop up with straw man fallacy, add in ad hominem attacks, muddy the waters, poison the well, and then failing that attempt at projection of hypocrisy to invalidate the credibility of the one asking, upon which the question is asked, what is the basis that human life takes precedent? Like many other debates where the counterparty makes a claim like, well, it's obvious, it has no argument, they will try to shift the burden of proof with an added dollop of bullshit that we're obligated to clear up, and it just gets so freaking tiresome. The ad hominem, you're obviously stupid, followed up by a loaded question, you do know that humans are superior, right? And then with a twist of credibility attack, you must hate humans to say that, and therefore it's obvious you are prejudiced against me being a human, and therefore you can't be trusted to argue reasonably. Poisoning the well and all that shit. By the way, the trick in responding this isn't to fall in the trap of arguing with their deflections, or red herrings, it's just rubbish. It's counterintuitive, but as we said a moment ago, just accept it. Yep, I agree, but what's your argument? Yep, I'm dumb, I can't be trusted, I can't argue reasonably, but tell me why humans are more important than any other species. Don't let them deflect. Don't let them throw you off. I think it's a much easier exercise to delegitimize the interlocutor or a counterparty in an argument than it is to actually meaningfully engage with their ideas and have them engage with our ideas. Any old bloody fool can throw insults and engage in fallacious thinking. It's almost the default position. It takes quite a bit more work to be intellectually honest, to have done some good investigation beforehand, lots of preparation, and to act in good faith and to actually take on the other person's ideas and notions, even though you might not believe them or want them to be true, but certainly to take time to investigate what they are and what they mean, their intent behind them, and how that they know that they're true, and then to actually find the implications of what those arguments are, whether they actually hold up under scrutiny, and to avoid fallacious thinking in that investigation. It's actually quite a lot of work. Our Prime Minister tried this today, I think, in the House of Commons under question time. It was pretty subtle. So the question was, I think, approximated to why aren't we holding up to our promise of doing all these COVID-19 tests? And the Prime Minister said, well, it's a surge in demand, which is one of those dumb things to say. It's like, It's almost admitting that the extra demand that either wasn't foreseen has made it impossible to supply that demand. But the question is, well, why has there been a sudden surge in demand, Prime Minister? What's going on? So when it comes to species and natural resources, humans get the cut of the cake and first choice of it. There are arguments to be had. Again, I'm no anthropologist, so I'll state fair warning there. But it's something that I've noticed. Certain parts of the world do put particular animals high up on the do not harm list. Sacred cows, pigs and pork and dogs. And I wonder why, we might laugh a little bit and mock ideas of sacred cows, but when you look into it, the irony is so sweet. The way I've come to know it, the way I've understanding it, is back in the day, cows in India, for example, cows were slaughtered and eaten. Though for various reasons, some economic, some ethical, we might imagine reasons as to show selective restraint in killing milk-producing cows. Hence, cows of such status became unslayable. And I suspect over time this attitude and the reasons for it became forgotten, and it just became the way. Habit, profit, good fortune resulted. So this habit of not killing milk-producing cows was profitable. It was good fortune. Don't kill cows. And when asked why don't kill milk-producing cows, the response became, it's just the way it is. And then mixing that with the popular religious beliefs in the region about doing no harm and living in harmony with nature, and the general notion of the sacredness of life, things emerge, and I can see if I squint my eyes how a parent of that time would explain this to a small child. Life is precious. We don't go around killing, just as we don't kill the mother cows looking after their young. And thus the cow, for legacy, historical and economic reasons, became a symbol of the sacredness of life. And then along comes some ruler or king who wants to ingratiate himself with their citizenry and, as Machiavelli suggests, give the people what they want on trivial matters. And so the prince wants to show he's just like his peoples and he's in touch, and so enshrines a populist trivial rule into royal purview. And so one king or prince or ruler declared, yes, killing cows is so abhorrent, and thus it is now forbidden by a royal decree, a bit of virtue signalling, and with the added bonus of being able to fine anybody who breaks such a royal decree. Yes, it's an excuse to lock away a few people on trivial matters that the public, after all, said was important, so they've got no complaint. What a load of shit. But yeah, that's... it's kind of politics, isn't it? Here we are. The politicians put so many things in the manifesto, they can't possibly achieve all of it. And so they'll pick and choose, and then they'll say that that's the mandate that the people voted for. Well, no, they voted for... Well, perhaps some voted for all of it. Some didn't perhaps like parts of it, and people vote for lots of different reasons and lots of different policies. So no, it's not a mandate, but this is what we're here, isn't it? Brexit, mandate of the people. I don't know, maybe I'm making it up. The irony to me, though, is in the fact that in our Western culture we mock sometimes the idea of sacred cows when it isn't really about the cow. The cow's the symbol of the sacredness of life and a culture and religion and tradition that respects and considers those ethics. And we miss the point, too busy looking at the cows. Likewise, too busy looking at flags and allegiances to said flags. And picking on our US comrades because, of course... I suspect it's too late, though. The US is very close to being a failed state. The UK seems to have a penchant for following them, so I'm a bit worried. And indeed, the UK and the USA, for some reasons, are seen as the vanguard of global morality. I think that's gone too. The UK currently breaking its treaties with apparent impunity. The US, their pledge of allegiance to the flag of the United States and America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all, something like that. Lots of clauses in there, sneaking things in over time, adding to it. I should perhaps take my own advice and edit down this audio script from the 154,000 words and distill it quite a lot. But who has that kind of time? Instead, you're paying the price. So instead of focusing on cows and flags, the notion is tokenized, and then the token almost becomes a transferable instrument. It's a branding thing. It's like, you take some silk scarf, throw ink at it, it's worth £10. Stitch a logo on it like Hermes, it's now worth £300. It's just transferring of the brand. It makes people comfortable, it's tokenizing, but simplify. That's what I'm saying about this script. I should have simplified, be concise. So instead of all that bullshit, pledge allegiance to the flag and states and nations and one nation, I pledge allegiance to liberty and justice. Much better, clear, concise. And as we've said before on the channel, clarity beats clever every time. And priority means one. You don't get two priorities. This is what Bob Iger said. You get one priority by definition, just one. And if you're really good, and I mean really exceptional, two. So liberty, one, and justice, two. And they have to be exceptional to get them both. So it's about the concepts, not the token. The idea, not the flashy token. And I'll mention tokenization later. Keeping in mind when I mention poppies. Then again, this could all be a misunderstanding based on popularized and perpetuated stereotypes. You know, Hindus are vegetarian. I'm not even sure. As I say, I'm speculating onto how this particular instance, how change over time, and that often without the cultural context, the original intent is lost. And that reminds me, have we done Death of the Author yet? I don't think we have. Anyway, maybe come back to that later. Ethics. Utilitarianism. We have two kinds of ethics. Two models of an ethical model, deontological and consequentialist, and utilitarian falls under the consequentialist, distinct from virtue ethics. So utilitarianism has, at its core, the notion that it's the consequence of actions, laws, policies, and so on that determine whether they are good or bad, right or wrong, by the consequences, by the utility of taking those actions. So utilitarianism would select for outcomes that produce the best overall results. And questions about what is good and for who and when. And since this involves a future prediction, we are talking about actual consequences or foreseeable consequences. It's tricky stuff. And I'm afraid the full answer is kind of way beyond any insight I can bring here, but I'm just bringing the fact up that it's tricky because we're relying on our capability of predicting the future, the outcome. So again, it comes back to causality. We need to understand the chains of cause and effect very thoroughly to be able to say what an outcome will happen from a particular cause. Virtue ethics, by the way, it's all about performing a role. So it's not about outcome. It's about a role. It's about how we do things, not necessarily... I mean, it is a little bit about what we do, but in terms of only our action and not the consequence. It's about performing a role commensurate with what a virtuous person, someone with ideal character traits, would do. Critics have argued that this is very self-centered, chasing the good life for self, to a point, but there is something in here too. For example, being kind for no other reason than it's one's character could be seen as operating from a virtue ethic, if that character has been honed with purpose. It's a good question. How should I live my life? And what is the good life? And I wonder what life would be like if we all adopted a notion of developing virtuous character, and as a consequence, we become kind to each other. Now, I can't tell if I'm taking a consequentialist view of virtue ethics. I might even be confusing myself. Well, another concern with virtue ethics, as hinted, is, say, parental influence. We might be lucky and have highly virtuous parents through no fault of our own, or we might have parents that have developed highly tuned vices if we are very, very lucky. Joke. Wrong way around. I know, I'm joking. But you get what I'm saying. So it's like IQ, the colour of our skin, and the wealth of our parents is beyond our control. Yet systems of discrimination sought for this stuff. Some of it is rejected, some of it is sought out. So ought we blame people for such things outside of their control? Virtue ethics also faces criticism on the basis of so-called luck or happenstance. How do we know what good virtues are in the first place without having some inbuilt virtue to know? Or which model of virtue should we latch onto? Of course, this is kind of a ridiculous question because should infers a moralistic judgment of which virtues to select for. So the point I'm trying to make, if any, is it by design or is it happy accident as to which virtues we're exposed to and latch onto and in what order as we meander through life? In other words, it seems hit and miss. This criticism, however, is embraced, and virtue ethicists say yes indeed, so much can go wrong, and that's why virtue ethics is all the more valuable. I do not share this point of view. I could think of another criticism that if well-developed virtue ethics is rare, then practitioners ought to have recognised that and got together to roll out virtue ethics schools or something. Then I stop and ask, why has this not happened? Again, I'm wondering if I'm applying a consequentialist apparatus to virtues. But can something be virtuous just because it's rare? I don't think so. I wonder similarly if it's occurred to virtue ethicists to teach virtue ethics with volition because it delivers good consequences. But then that really is consequentialism. The 18th century British philosophers, Hutchinson, Hume, Adam Smith, appealed to an imaginary, impartial spectator as the test for moral judgment. Utilitarians, famously Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill and others, take it as self-evident that in deciding moral issues, each counts for one and none for more than one. And Rawls incorporated the same into his own theory by deriving basic ethical principles from an imaginary choice behind a veil of ignorance that prevents those from choosing, from knowing whether they will be the ones who gain or lose by the principles they select. We've mentioned this before in a description of a really crass process of dispute settlement. Allow party A, to draw up the plans in entirety of how resources will be split between two parties. Accept that plan unequivocally. Then give choice to B as to which split to pick. A is now at the mercy of their own equity. Even with white supremacists, have them draw up the plans for segregation and how to divide the lands and the resources. As soon as the plan is presented, accept it in its entirety, and then give the first choice of the set of resources and lands and divisions to the other team. The cake, the pizza slicing thing. So ethics takes a universal vantage point of consideration. This does not mean that a particular ethical judgment must be universally applicable. Again, the emphasis is on the process and the systems of ethics, not the actual judgment drawn from it. So I should say it is a universal consideration, but in application it might not necessarily be. Some ethical systems do consider outcome over and above the rules. Other frameworks prioritise the rules and not the outcome, and some the virtue, as described. So I get the sense it's more along the lines of putting yourself in someone else's shoes to take on their context, their values, and then evaluate what might be in their best interests, and in this realise that their preferences carry just as much weight as our own. Therefore, why should we weight our own preferences just because they are our own? So the question of the species bias earlier was a setup for this question. How can we justify selecting a moralistic framework that favours our own preference? The question elicits the same frustration. People want the cake, but just can't put forward a good argument as to why they are to be favoured over others. Yeah, I hear from time to time something about deserves. I laugh on the inside, but I don't let on. We all deserve. Even if we did, suppose we did, we must then allow that everyone else weights their preferences similarly. It seems if we implemented this approach, no agreements or compromise could ever happen. Everyone would insist their way being implemented. Such a rule then is actually impossible to implement, and this is a subtlety of Kant's famous formula. Act only on that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. In this case, implementation is impossible, regardless of will. It's what I meant earlier in terms of being even logically possible. It's like saying everyone can have the whole of the cake. As nice as that would be, there is only one cake. To abstract, if we took all the preferences and put them in a tumbler and mixed them up where we didn't know whose was whose, and we asked an impartial agent to pick one, on what basis should we give instructions on how to choose? It might even be leading to say pick the best. Best in what way? What are the universally true or accepted or right? I can't even phrase this in a reasonable way. What are the rules, process or method that can be universally applied to select preferences amongst interested parties? It's here that a bit of confusion creeps in under a strawman argument aimed to simplify this nuance. Some say, aha, that means objective or prescribed universal values. No, that's not what it means. And then some try again, aha, well it must mean relativistic then, it depends on the context as to the moral values. Nope, not that either. What it does mean is that making ethical judgments means that we at least go beyond our own likes and dislikes. Ethics goes beyond I and you to a universal standpoint of the impartial spectator or kind of idealised observer. There's a perceptual position thing. It was John Iadarola from the Damage Report who described it using circles. Some people's circle of concern is as large as the planet. The atmosphere, the biosphere, the plants, the animals, and of course humans, nations, peoples, cultures and so on. And John described that some people's circles are so small that they don't even encompass their own brain. Can we use this universal aspect to derive an ethical framework that will reveal right and wrong? Many philosophers have attempted this. No attempt has met with general acceptance, so no. On the channel we've talked about needs and wants and desires, and that all people are doing is perceiving the world and deciding actions on those perceptions to reach needs, to obtain wants and desires. I think a lot of the time we make the mistake of assuming our needs and wants are global. It might not have occurred to us what other people want, and what they need and desire are different things, or even if they are the same, they want to get there by different means, which seems somehow as important. Some people even do have a need, a personal and individual need, to accommodate others' needs in principal decision making. It's not just like an option or a desire, it's one of their basic needs. Some people need love, some people need shelter, some people need food, some people need to know that other people are catered for first. It seems rare, and when you explain this to some people, they look at you like you're batshit crazy, like how is that ever a thing? So I don't know whether, have we mentioned Lex M's yet on the channel? I think we might have done on behavioural economics. Politeness, it's a kind of Lex M. It's a conceptual idea. Its implementation is different in different regions and different in different cultures. But the concept, the idea, the lexis of politeness is universal. Well, there's some speculation as to whether that's actually true, but you get the idea. You know, while we have different implementations, we understand that politeness or manners or tradition of actions or phrasing things to make life easier in whatever form that takes is highly prevalent. It's also entwined with politics and control, but that's another story. We'll come back to that when we do politeness theory. Same with ethics. To use a shorthand, let's call our needs, wants and desires and methods of getting them our preferences. When we put ourselves in the position of others and take on their preferences and start to think about how they would make decisions according to these preferences, we're thinking ethically. That is to say, our preferences have no more weight than anyone else's. When all preferences for each are plugged into a decision process that leads to a course of action that is likely to maximally realise preferences of those affected, we are along the lines of being ethical. And in this particular example, this would be slanted to a so-called utilitarian model. And as we've already hinted, there are intangibles, perhaps what Lowenstein was referring to when he wrote his book Exotic Preferences. Things like a sense of well-being, honour, comfort. So imagine a resource, shared and distributed according to preferences of all present. Some may not even care about the resulting size of the cake, but care more that the slicing was done with integrity. Some again may be indifferent to the shape of the slice, but are satisfied knowing that the right ceremonial knife was used in the cutting of the cake, and that the slicing was done according to tradition. At least there was cake. Speaking of ceremony, and to give an example of how important ceremony, tradition and doctrine is, the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith declared that any baptisms performed with a modified formula were invalid. Some Catholic churches and priests decided to make a minor change to the wording of the baptismal rite, using the phrase "we baptize" in place of "I baptize," to denote the involvement of the entire parish community in the child's developing faith. In a recently reported case from the Archdiocese of Detroit, according to the church's logic, he couldn't possibly be a priest because he wasn't even actually a Christian. This was uncovered when a video of this baptism, dating back to the 1990s when camcorders were all the rage, revealed that the modified language was used, thus effectively failing to baptize him altogether. The Archdiocese said that it was a pretty devastating thing to find out, and he was shocked, he said, and saddened to find out 30 years later that he never was actually baptized. He said it was an alienating sense that even though he thought he was following the Lord, he wasn't even a Christian, he wasn't a priest, and he wasn't a deacon. This has also called into question many confessions given to priests and deacons who were baptized with the modified language, meaning that they weren't really baptized. So all those confessions, they're out. There's even some question about marriage. They're saying it's a bit of a grey area. If both members of the couple received invalid baptisms, their unions were not real. Though the Archdiocese offers some comfort and says their entirety of their otherwise, I don't know how to describe it, pious wedding, valid marriage, is not a sin. I.e., having nookie outside of official wedlock that can't have been granted because the priest who granted it wasn't a priest, because he'd been baptized with the new wording. He says it's not a sin because sin isn't possible, while the couple were completely unaware of the possible sacramental invalidity of their marriage. Yeah, again, ignorance to the rescue. Alright, I can have a little bit of a laugh at this because, it's, to me, just shows the ridiculousness of it all. It's all hinged on one word change. As I said in the previous video, I'm softening a little bit to religion, only insofar as that it makes individuals in some sense feel better. I'll probably do a quick insert about anxiety as well. There's definitely a link between religion and faith in God above and reduction of anxiety. But it's a double-edged sword. But this story goes deeper because in this regard, a feeling of comfort, those who had their last rites performed, if by one of these priests who's not a priest, won't count either. Anybody who's made a confession of a serious sin, the confession is out, it's invalid, which theoretically means that person can be thrown to hell for all eternity on a technicality. Now, what was said also about this matter is quite interesting in terms of virtue ethics and consequentialism. The Archdiocese has made an effort to soften the blow for faithful parishioners. He said, "We can be comforted in the fact that it is deeply pleasing to God when an individual makes every effort to follow his plan exactly for baptism and the forgiveness of sins. We can be assured that anyone who has died after seeking in good faith to receive baptism from the deacon or from confessions from the Archdiocese, that they did not leave this life without some measure of grace and forgiveness from God. Therefore, it seems to be that if God is pleased by intent, then why does the letter of the law matter at all? It seems the Church wants it both ways." So questions are being raised. What about these people who have been improperly baptized? In this particular circumstance of invalid baptisms, what happens if the person went on to be a priest or a bishop, all the while technically invalid? One has to ask, is the Pope Catholic? We might not actually know. Suppose now, though, that we have sliced and diced and allocated the cake according to a maximised preference, and everyone's satisfied. And now there is no cake left. And some might worry that there is no more resource left for tomorrow, or indeed for the next generation. How is this accounted for? Well, at least we're asking the question. Conveniently, when this is concerned with matters as trivial as cakes, we know in this world of consumerism we can easily go and purchase another cake. It's assumed there will always be cake. This thinking, when habitualised, avoids the question, what happens when we run out of cake, or oil, or coal, or breathable air, or land to grow foods to make cake, or, more contemporarily at the moment, fish. Ah, yes, common fisheries policy. So the first question is, what happens if any state or country or collective overfishes and depletes the stock? No fish and chips for the future kids. So we have to first find out what level of fishing is sustainable. This will be science-driven rather than policy-driven. Science will provide as good an answer as any as we can get. And then the next question is, how do we divvy up that catch, that sustainable amount, across many countries? Here we are. It gets complicated as fish like to swim in different locations, and depending on where the fish is caught, it should not matter. However, the UK, being an island, has its claimed territorial waters, and other countries have fishing rights in these waters. European countries have their territorial waters, and UK fishermen also have rights to fish in those waters, likewise, up to quota. The issue is, the fish seem to like to swim around the UK territorial waters, and European fishermen caught 3 times the amount of fish in UK waters as UK fishermen caught in continental Europe's waters. So it looks very unfair. But you've got to add back into the equation how much UK fishermen caught in UK waters, and then how much fishermen from the continent caught in continental waters. And another thing that's overlooked is the UK sold off a lot of fishing quotas quite some time ago, hence they're not actually entitled to collect so many fish. So of course it's going to look imbalanced. For example, a Dutch company with a UK subsidiary alone holds 24% of English fishing quota. This is a rich man's game. The quotas can be traded, leased, and as one firm did, it leased out its rights, its fishing quota rights, and made £2.5 million profit without having a boat. And the usual has happened. Rich individuals and corporations now dominate the quotas, and the smaller, family-sized or local businesses just can't compete. I suspect that while these smaller businesses have legitimate complaint, again, the press and other vested interests and big money stir it up to be an issue of EU or sovereignty or Brexit or being unfair in some way without telling the full story. The nature of large-scale efficiencies made by super trawlers that dock at huge ports that have massive distribution and logistics infrastructures are going to prefer huge transactions rather than small boats coming in at all hours with different catches, and it just the scale of efficiency just wins at every time. It almost seems as though it costs these ports more money to process smaller and more fragmented catches. Here we are seeing consolidation, the inevitability of capitalism. European Union law limits the amount of fish that may be landed each year. The total allowable catch is set to preserve fish stocks. Each member state, including the UK, receives an agreed share of the total allowable catch as its quota. The UK quota is divided between England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. If the UK fishing fleet exceeds its quota, the quota may be reduced and there could be large fines. So this is one solution to the well-known problem, the tragedy of the commons, where when any one person acts rationally to maximise their own profit, when everyone does that, it actually destroys the very thing that they're harvesting, then no one gets any. There are lots of solutions to this problem, and we mentioned one before with the dam and the farmers, the upstream and downstream, the different crops, and how labour is used to compensate a lower yielding crop due to lack of access or lack of priority to water. Mothers do it on a rota system, and fisheries seem to do it on a quota system. So yeah, this the phenomenon of the tragedy of the commons, it's not an easy one to solve, but what seems to be key is the ability of the participants to live with the tension and the uncertainties inherent in the solutions. So while equity and fairness is the goal, agreement is the compromise, and uncertainty and tension will always exist. And the ability to live with it requires some mitigation, usually I suspect through some antagonistic feedback. You cut the cake, we get first pick, that suits this year, but next year the feedback is that it didn't work so well, so we're going to have to try and change the method by which we seek equity. The cutting of the cake is a solution for a very specific example, and it's illustrative of a very simple case, but it doesn't fit all solutions. We've also mentioned on the channel before, we hinted just a few moments ago, hedonics, the discounting of economic value according to the pleasure or pain involved. Yeah, it really goes on, and financially it's considered, it's factored into things like the CPI. Hedonic quality adjustment refers to a method of adjusting prices whenever the characteristics of the product included in the CPI, for example, change due to innovation or the introduction of completely new products. New products, it's a novelty, and that novelty is reckoned to have a financial value. And that financial value is estimated in real money, and then that's factored into consumer price indexes. So one has to ask, if they're taking good feelings, essentially, and monetizing those to discount or load up the consumer price index, you have to ask what kind of latitude or what kind of volatility is on these pricing baskets. So from this, it's not just consequence now, it has this hedonic factor built in. So this is a model of hedonic utilitarianism, slightly different from preference utilitarianism. For me, it starts to get complicated. I think this is where I certainly need to have a think. Preference utilitarians would say the preferences that should be considered are those in which we are both fully informed and thinking on with clarity that would lead to our preferences being fulfilled. Naturally, misinformation gets in the way. Misconceptions distort our perception, and we might think we're selecting for utility, and we may well be, but if the input data is skewed and we don't know it, the output may well be suboptimal, yet we are convinced it's at least ethical. Hedonic utilitarians would weight the argument to happiness rather than preference satisfaction. Then the question comes, is it possible that in dropping our preferences, we gain happiness? So the example often cited is the poet who gives up some happiness for having something to write about. Case, again, another one often cited is the belief that winning the lottery would change people's happiness. And it does until the novelty wears off, and apparently that's quite quick, and I don't believe it. With a significant win like 20-30 million, you can burn through the juvenile phase of fast cars and McMansions and bling to realise what impact significant wealth can have on other people's lives. I guess a small win like 1 or 2 million just gets burned through pretty quick. Schwarzenegger, in one of his humorous moments of many, stated similarly when he blithely reckoned that more money doesn't bring more happiness. He said he's just as happy with 50 million as he was with 48 million. Twat. But yeah. Well then, perhaps he could give away half and still not feel any loss and still be as happy. Yeah, see, it works both ways. Of course, then, money isn't about happiness, is it? There was an interesting book I actually read on the small business of lottery conversions. Very niche business. So in the US, for example, where the mega lotteries are hundreds of millions and from time to time they do get won, it's paid out in installments. Of course, the winner wants to cash now, and so will sell slices of those fixed incomes to conversion houses at discount. And those conversion houses actively seek out winners, their desires, and really play on their addictions, and will persuade the winners to eventually and frivolously discount their entire win for immediate short gain and short-term satisfactions, of course, while taking their fees and gaining the long-term asset. Yeah, the lottery is a negotiable instrument, at least in the USA. I don't know about anywhere else. So if this is true, I ought to drop my hedonic value in buying lottery tickets and seek happiness itself, rather than the proxy, which is indulging in the fantasy that brings short-term happiness, pretending what I'll buy if I win, with the sadness that this week, when Friday rolls around and I didn't get the email saying I won, that it just wasn't to be. In other words, it's actually the happiness that I care about and not the satisfaction of the preference. Some even say, and again I'm sceptical, that winning the lottery decreases overall happiness. The so-called winner's curse. I keep hearing it, but I think this is one of those hedonic preferences in action. We'd all rather believe this is true, as it makes us feel better when we don't win it. I'm almost troubled by emotional state, hot and cold states. In the heat of the moment, I suspect our internal hedonic gauge shifts. It's very relativistic. After a few beers and a few rails of Colombian's finest and a couple of Viagras put to good use, we're really going to have to push the boat out to get more pleasure. However, life seems a bit grim at the moment, and with the pandemic and the economy and business and livelihoods being destroyed, finding a lost £20 note could bring an enormous amount of joy and relief right now. Oh, and whilst we're talking about China White, we also, and especially when under the influence, we tend not to think about the misery left in the wake of drug smuggling and the disastrous effects on the war on drugs has had. What would a virtuous person do? What about a utilitarian? Professional sales always bugged me as well, that a professional seller would actually decode how the prospect views the world and how they make decisions. And then they sell into that to present information and arguments in a way that is not objectionable. It's always pitched to me as efficient, as best for the customer. But I sometimes wonder if this isn't a self-justification for the abuse and manipulation. It's the pain and pleasure thing. Find the pain, twist the thumb screws, and then offer the way out. And that creates high value, and therefore higher prices can be demanded, but in accordance with the prospect's moral framework. Amateurs try it on with phrases like, "You deserve it, don't you? Doesn't God want you to have this?" It just feels slimy. I'll give you an example. Many years ago I received a phone call. They were trying to sell burglar alarms, and the woman on the phone called up and said, "Oh, did you know that you live in a high crime area?" And I said, "No, I didn't know that. What's this about?" And she said, "Well, we can sell alarms to give you peace of mind." So there she's created a fear, and now bringing in a product to alleviate that fear that I didn't know I had. At the time I was renting, so I said, "Well, I'm renting, and it's against the tenancy agreement to have any electronic equipment installed that needs holes drilling or will interfere with things, so I can't have it fitted. But now that you've made me very worried and very fearful about being burgled, what are you going to do to put that right?" See, I just want her to know that she's causing misery with no solution, but these sales guys don't give a fuck. So how about this one then? We're in the middle of this pandemic. Well, I'll say in the middle. It's been August 2020 at the time of scripting and recording. September. Middle of September. say 2 or 3 weeks to do the graphics recording and get it uploaded to YouTube. Perhaps it's going to be in late October. So I'm not even sure that we can claim that we're in the middle of this. But anyway, as things like this get worse, doctors in hospitals are forming death panels to decide who has the best chance of survival, when people are really ill from this. And in terms of the utility for quality of life years, or QALYs as they are known, QALY, quality of life years, it's a horrible decision to make. I think I have more to say about this in a minute, but consider the ethics of the anti-maskers. Through their action, they're not actively reducing the spread of the virus, but actually increasing it. And when people get very sick and end up in hospital because of the numbers involved and resources are exhausted, there is the matter of resource allocation. Yeah, so these anti-mask pricks not only killing people, but also forcing doctors to make horrible choices in selecting who to keep on ventilators and who to send home to die. And all because they don't want to wear something that's so similar to a scarf. Freedom, they say. Freedom to kill people, I ask? Or freedom to save people's lives and end this pandemic quicker? Virtue or utilitarian? And then we get into all that ethics about life analysis, QALYs and DALYs and other time horizon adjustments discounted for quality of life, the burden of being ill, an allocation of scarce medical resource. Ought we give the last bed to grandma or the severely ill 35-year-old? What's our preference? What's grandma's preference? What's the 35-year-old's preference? And does that change if he or she has kids or not? The last piece of information, by the way, hints at the solution method. Can we, and on what basis, justify it? If we have a substantial moral argument, then yes, it's justified. Does it make it right, though? I don't know. Yeah, so QALYs, quality-adjusted life years, and DALYs are disability-adjusted life years. So it's some kind of calculus to derive a cost-effective analysis to work out the cost per QALY gained or the cost of DALY averted. Yeah, so it's not so cut and dried. Facts we've defined, verifiable points of data. What about values? And what about internal values or external values? We hear talk of proposals involving no value judgments, whereby the assumption is that what we ought to do is what is better for some people and worse for none. That is in of itself a value judgment, one we assume to be valid. It's perhaps that everyone agrees with it, that the assumption is never tested. It's an assumed axiom, self-evident, but nevertheless it's a judgment. It might be one, say we in the West, take as given, but those elsewhere may see it differently. It seems to me also language can alter our perception. A recent example was made explicit, but I started to get the notion of this when I dated a Brazilian woman from Rio. She'd have these quirks in her use of English. So she'd use expressions like pen in the table, whereas a native English speaker would say pen on the table. But I hasten to add, she knew bigger words and had a wider vocabulary of English than I did. That's not saying much, but to make the point, English was certainly not new to her. English also seems peculiar in its highly abstract nouns. As I say, I'm barely proficient, but is a passing observation. So in English, glove. In German, Handschlag. So in English, you have to know what a glove refers to. In German, if you know what hand is, and a shoe, Handschlag, you might guess the meaning of handshoe. And I'm always fascinated by the cuts of meat described in English. Sirloin, flank, rump. If you know, you know. And in one word, sirloin, flank, has been expressed not only the species that's being consumed, but what specific part of it. And if you think about it, that makes commercial activity of accounting rather efficient. And a quick glance shows that there are about 20 English cuts of beef, slightly above average. German, 16, which seems to be the same for the rest of the world except France, which has 29. Of course, certain cuts are more expensive. Why is this? I have no idea. I wonder what the basis is. Is it per pound pricing, that per cattle unit there's more rump than, say, sirloin? Or is it the meat that's away from the extremities is more tender? Or is it that look of disdain when the waiter takes an order for de poitrine rather than, say, a thick sirloin or for filet? Yeah, who orders big breasts in a fine dining restaurant? Maybe you do. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe you're walking with them. I don't fucking know. In English, have is a possessive term. The term doesn't exist in some languages, and the equivalent is a statement that is closer to the notion of being. So the English have separates and elevates the person from the thing. It gives us the idea that we, the I, the person, the individual, is somehow separated from its surroundings. It's a different outlook, but one native English speakers are accustomed to. By the way, this stuff of analysis of language is mega business right now. Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, all of those billions of tweets, comments, Facebook posts, they're not just put out there for free for you to use by these tech giants. Oh, no. Your pronouns, verbs, and presuppositions and prepositions say so much about you, me, us. The one I like, and it kind of makes me laugh, it has been noticed that poets that use the noun and nominalization I to excess in their writings are at higher risk of suicide. I mean, I shouldn't laugh, but it's only because I see the sad irony of life. You know, that poets give up happiness to have something to write about, but where I is used in abundance and thereby making the works self-referenced is indicative of suicidal ideation. I shouldn't laugh. It seems that there is more than a kernel of truth in the saying, dying for one's art. Further than this, though, what about mapping world leader tweets and using analysis of pronouns to the likelihood that they would actually follow through on military actions rather than being a bluff? Alright, let me try one on you then. I'll dump one on you. A piece of information that once you know, you can't unknow, but it will be a moral imposition. Turns out, those who share traumatic events with another have less health issues than those who keep such events to themselves. Therefore, consequentialists, do you have a moral obligation to listen when friends say they need to talk, or to even inquire and encourage people to talk about traumatic events and secrets they're keeping? With virtue ethicists, yeah, you got out of it again, so how far do we go? Either way, deontological, hedonic or utilitarian preferences, consequentialists are seeking out some universality. It's not an average, it's not what most people actually prefer, it's not a census of opinion, whatever that is, but it's a universal mechanism. There are a few problems though. Those preferences are based on what we know and what we believe, and that might be false, unfounded or wishful thinking. Therefore, the preferences that ought to be considered are not the ones we actually hold, but those that we would hold if we had perfect information. And a quick mention on equality, as this one seems misunderstood too. There is equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. The former has a tricky question embedded in it. Why do we not all have equal opportunity? Is it oppression, discrimination, geography, genetics, or environment? Is it nepotism, corruption? Well, it's kind of all of it. And if so, ought others be burdened with compensating the balance? Alright, enough of this one, and we'll come back and answer that question in the next one.